Hello, everyone. All right, so getting the names down. Hope you guys are doing well. All right, so today, tonight, the War for Independence argumentative essay is due. So hopefully you've been able to take a look at the video. All right. Let's see. So now we are looking at the life under the Articles of Confederation. See, I'm missing one name.
Mr. Cal, I got a question for you. What chapter are these on
That's a great
in the,
question.
in the textbook?
No problem. I believe it's chapter 6. Let me make sure. So the assignment due tonight is chapter 5. All right. No, actually it's chapter 5.
Both of them are chapter 5. The one we went over on Monday and today is chapter 5.
Yes.
Okay, let me look.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Or wait.
I think it's farther along.
Yeah, no, it includes chapter 6 as well. I apologize. Yeah, so mainly chapter 5 for the one due tonight and chapter 6 for the one due next. All right. So what happens, right, is from 1775 in April when fighting begins, you have the War for Independence. We technically win our independence in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. And then from 1783, we're really during that time as well, from 1776, the states, it's going to, the Second Continental Congress is going to morph into the Articles of Confederation. So we're going to try a Confederate form of government from 1776 to 1787. All right. So it doesn't last very long. It only lasts 11 years. And technically, it goes into full force at the end of the War for Independence. So in some ways, the Articles of Confederation only lasted 4 years, from 83 to 87. All right. And so what we're doing on this assignment is we're undergoing that transition. And the first number, you notice you only have 2 argumentative sections on this one, is I ask you to look into a very kind of a monotonous, it's retained its influence, this kind of monolithic influence or interpretation to the Articles of Confederation. I want to apologize. I'm normally pretty proud of the fact that there are several argumentative takes on the same subject, right? I stand by that philosophically. I want you to see as many, facets and arguments to every given subject as possible. And I apologize that I'm kind of just giving the same old interpretation to number 1. All right. They're just really, as far as U.S. history, this is one of the subjects that is kind of bereft of a good dialogue, as far as having at least 2 influential, heavily cited interpretations that are divergent from each other on the same topic. So I want to begin by kind of apologizing that I'm giving you just one on number 1 in the argumentative section. All right. But because of its popularity, for any of you, however small a number, who are going to major in history, it's imperative that you look over this and become familiar with this historiographical take on this topic. Okay. And so, yeah, with number 1, it's nothing new. It's nothing that thought provocative. It's been around for a very long time. And not to mention, it's kind of court history, right? It's defending the founding fathers for their decision to get rid of the Confederation. All right. So keep that in mind. And again, like I said, I apologize. Normally, I'm very proud of the fact that I could give you at least 2 interpretations to the same topic. Although I will mention a second one that's intertwined with it, but you won't find it in here. All right. And matter of fact, let me start with that kind of revisionist interpretation. Is the Articles of Confederation, right? They did not serve in many ways the ideological plans, right? What the conservatives really believed in and what they aspired to and what they thought was synonymous with natural greatness and what their goals were. But also, it didn't coincide with their own personal interests and their own positions in society. And so that's more of a revisionist, a negative take on us scrapping this confederation. All right. And the interpretation goes is that many of the founding fathers, again, as I mentioned in the previous argumentative section, they're they oftentimes demographically tended to be those tied to trade, to international commerce and banking, and also many of them were creditors. They had money owed to them, right, as men of wealth, and the Confederation uh, did not meet their needs, did not help them attain their personal wishes, if you will, right? So, for instance, the payment of debts did not go smoothly during this confederation. Many of those who had money owed to them continued to have money owed to them throughout the Confederate period. They wanted better international standing with our international creditors, because remember the Continental Congress and the Articles of Confederation owed money to foreign banks and foreign nations, and we didn't make good on paying off those debts. So people like Alexander Hamilton, as a conservative, was very frustrated about this, right, and felt like this was going to harm the nation in the future for a very practical reason. For one, right, is that we were not going to we're going to develop a poor reputation internationally as far as being irresponsible and paying back our debts. So much for his future plans of having a system under George Washington's administration that was highly in need of income, of revenue, because he wanted government intervention in the economy, in particular, to help subsidize his plan for us becoming commercialized, having trade from one region to the next, trade internationally across the Atlantic and in the Caribbean, etc. And the Confederation did not facilitate that, right? Not to mention also just the very practical reason is that the the conservatives, they had an elitist view, right? We talked about this last, I believe we did, and if not, we'll cover it right now, and it might also carry over to the Constitution. Is that they wanted the better sort to rule. Because what you have to remember is the founding fathers, right? Those who ended up taking control of the new Constitution and the new federal republic under which we live to this day, right? They had a kind of an elitist view. What they believed, right, was while all human beings, and let's face it, in their practical application, all white men, right, all kind of Euro-American white men, were entitled to the same opportunities, the same protections under the law. They did not believe that all men were equally capable of serving as politicians, right? I liken it to today, whereby you would say, okay, do you believe that all Americans in a contemporary context are entitled to the same rights, protections under the law, economic opportunities, et cetera, et cetera? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. The answer should be yes, as a good American, right? From the Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment that kind of informed our propaganda campaign during our break from England. But do you believe that everyone is equally capable of writing an English paper for you, of fixing your car? And of course, that's a rhetorical question too. The answer would be no, right? Some people are better skilled at in different areas, right? And so, what you have to remember also is the founding fathers, the leaders, right? Those who tended to be the elected assemblymen and somewhat the cream of the crop amongst the American colonists. Remember Howard Zinn's thesis, right, about them being a separate somewhat elitist class of people who represented the other colonists, is they were disproportionately college educated and they were disproportionately well read. And remember that coming from the colonial time period, their their education was largely classical. They read the Roman and Greco classics. Okay, and when you look at people like Aristotle and Plato, uh, you look at a very elitist side of politics, right? Whereby Aristotle is the one that contended that some people are physically well endowed, muscularly, with great physical strength, strong backs, and but with quote feeble minds, and that nature herself, right, God had prepared them to become the manual laborers, to become, he even went so far as to become the slaves of the thinking people, right? That was their role in society. I think of like functional theory, right? Whereby you look at society as one growing machine, like a human body, like a living organism, and that you need all parts. You need your intellectual brains, right, to help make the major decisions. You need your arms and legs and backs, your strong manual laborers to do their part as well. Not everyone could be the brain because you need the rest of the body for the whole body politic to function well and smoothly, right? So they believed that going back to Aristotle, that in some cases it was simply by nature. Some people are born, like I think of Plato and his Republic, right? That some people are born with more um, uh, virtue as far as morality, that they tend to be more civic minded. They look beyond themselves and they look to the entire community of what's best. So unselfish people, right? Broad minded people. And so Plato said, right, that those types of kids and his hypothetical school system ought to be separated from the other kids in a system of schooling, so that they ought to be set aside to be prepared to rule over the other kids who are less exceptional. And not only morally, right, to be more broad minded and civic minded, but also intellectually. The kids that are especially bright intellectually, right? And who could make wiser, more intelligent decisions. So you have that part of nature and the whole nature versus nurture thing, right? And then also, you have the component coming from English common law and history is the notion of leisure, is that some kids, especially, let's face it, those who are well to do, right, like Thomas Jefferson, did not have to work a day with their hands in their lives. They had the money, the wealth, and the leisure, the extra time to become well read and to learn about things like government, or what we would call political science today, right? Economics and the laws of economics. Because remember, the Enlightenment, it postured that there are natural laws behind everything. But what good uh, can you adhere to those natural laws? Because remember, the Enlightenment thought that the better you hold on and abide by natural laws, the more healthy society will be. Well, how do you know about those natural laws unless you've sat down and read books, classical books by great thinkers, right, going up through the Enlightenment? And so, hence, right, they felt like there should be a better sort who should be trusted and elected by their constituents to do the governing for us, right? That they ought to be good stewards. And when I think of stewardship, I think of like a babysitter, someone uh, with whom you entrust something that is sacred to you, right? Like your kids, to babysit them. And in this case, it's your political voice. It's what's best for your community, that you entrust these men who are better able than you are, like a mechanic who knows better about fixing your vehicle, right, in a contemporary context, than simply you or I. I'll especially say myself, who knows very little about mechanics and vehicles. And so entrusted to them, right, as the better sort, to have the time, the leisure, the background, the education, and also even the biological traits to be better, more effective, wiser, more civic minded um, politicians. Then on the other side of that coin, right, with Aristotle and Plato, is Aristotle in particular thought that in a very elitist fashion, that the average Greek, the average human, was oftentimes not only less intelligent, um, not only deprived of education and the leisure to prepare him or herself to be a good ruler and politician, but also that the average person is led by pathos instead of logos, that the average person is easily misled by his or her emotions, right? And that that person is oftentimes going to easily be swayed by what they would call a demagogue. And a demagogue, right, is someone who arguably claims to be one of the common people, but is anything but. It's a person usually that's well to do, that has been brought up in wealth and ease and privilege, and truly knows nothing what it's like to live as a common person. But the person puts up a good facade, right? Puts up a good facade and says, I'm one of you, right? A millionaire putting on a cowboy hat and driving a truck and using, his lexicon and his vocabulary that seem to imply he's just a common guy without any pretensions. But in reality, he's not that, right? It's somewhat of an act. And what he does, this demagogue, is he is in tune with the tools of manipulation. He knows what the people hate, what they desire, what they covet, um, and he pushes those buttons. He uses the right speeches, the right key words and phrases, the right issues that are very strongly attached to the emotions and the desires of the common people, and he plays on those, right? And basically tells the people he is going to give them what they want, right? He's going to give them, in many cases in human history, land, opportunity for loans to start their own business, right? And so, in telling them what they want to hear, they elect him and trust him to be their leader. And of course, to Aristotle, that's the beginning of the end of representative democracy, because he has his own agenda and it's eventually going to demonstrate itself and become manifest. But the people are not wise enough. They're not well prepared enough. They're not intelligent enough to see through that, right? And what also was going to make them highly easily manipulated is that he said the average person is led by his or her appetite. I think of like Freud in the id, right? As your id or your appetite, right? As like I think of a child, perhaps going into a restaurant and sees, some inviting food on the plate of a perfect stranger, uh, and tries to reach out and grab the food off that stranger's plate, right? The kid is just following his id, following his appetite, but he doesn't have sufficient yet reason, as the Greeks called it. Later on, Freud would call it your super ego, right? That says, wait, son, you shouldn't do that. That doesn't belong to you. Society frowns upon that. That constitutes theft, right? And that internal mom or dad that tells you, no, that's not a wise decision. So the Aristotle and other Greek and other opponents to democracy, remember the demos means the common people in Greek, ruled by the common people, they felt therefore was irresponsible and dangerous because they would just follow their id and whatever they desired without thinking about long-term repercussions or consequences. They would easily be duped by demagogues who they allowed to lead them. And oftentimes, right, what they would do, I think of, and I don't mean to do disservice to these gentlemen because this is not my area of expertise, but from my memory of prior education, I think of like the Gracchus brothers, Gracchus in Rome, whereby they told the representatives of the common people of Rome's republic, known as the tribunes, they would tell them, hey, the patricians, the aristocrats, remember Aristoi means the best, the people who claim to be the cream of the crop and get privileges on account of their background, family name, connections to the leaders, etc., right? And telling them, right, that these aristocrats are parasites. They are ruling at your expense. They have unfair advantages that you don't get to enjoy. And so hence what they're doing, right, is they're fomenting class warfare. They're getting they're playing on the again, the emotions, the desires, the resentments of the common uneducated people, and they're getting them to kind of foment this conflict with the well-to-do. And then in following in their id, if you will, their appetite, oftentimes like with the Gracchus brothers, they would say, okay, we want to get more political power and we want to give land, even if it constitutes in some cases um, confiscation of other people's land and redistributing that land to the common people. We want to give land to the people, for instance. Well, that's going to bring about conflict. People don't like giving up land that they rightfully own legally, right? And so hence it led with the Gracchus brothers and others to literally violence and legislative conflict between the tribunes, the popularly elected tribunes, and the Senate, right? Which was more aristocratic under Rome's Republic. And it helped bring about class warfare and drama, right? That may arguably have been avoided with wiser decisions, more moderate decisions, more moderate methods to go about attaining their goals, et cetera, et cetera. So even the liberal libertarians during the Articles of Confederation, during the War for Independence, like Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and others, right? Who contended that they believed in the sagacity of the common man. They believed that although the common man was not college educated, had not had time to read Enlightenment books and works, etc., didn't have the time or the means to do so, that they had a God-given common sense, a worldly wisdom, right? Street smarts, for lack of a better way of putting it, so that they can see through people, right? Politicians that are corrupt and dishonest. They can look into and make wise decisions at a practical level um, on any given situation, and that hence they ought to be trusted with more political power, despite their lack of education, despite their leisure and background, and etc. Right? But notice, even the liberals, like Thomas Jefferson, in debates with John Adams and others, they conceded and said, well, I do believe that especially before there is a public school system, before education is more equitably spread throughout the common population, that oftentimes we do agree that the people will adhere or engage in kind of rash, right, illogical, emotionally laden, selfish decisions, and that will perhaps be poor and even somewhat dangerous in the consequences thereof. That they simply thought that there was that those poor decisions will be less pernicious, less dangerous in their consequences than the decisions made by aristocrats who are well educated, know exactly what they're doing in political science, but who unethically make decisions parasitically that benefit themselves and harm everybody else. So what I'm saying is even the liberals, right, had read as well-educated leaders, they had a classical education and they had read classical criticism of democracy and how the common people oftentimes will be rash, emotionally led, and make poor and selfish decisions that might contribute to a bit of chaos, that might contribute to following a demagogue who will become a tyrant of some sort, right? And of inflicting conflict unnecessarily with the wealthy and the well-to-do. And so they saw it oftentimes as a lesser evil. Okay, they already somewhat conceded to some of those negative stereotypes about the common people ruling. All right. And so the argument goes on number one, which is a very long established argument, is that the Articles of Confederation played into the hands of the conservatives because the people, by and large, had their shot at government participation during this Confederacy. That the states, one by one, particularly look at the state of Pennsylvania, it initiated some radical reforms during the War for Independence. They greatly broadened the franchise. Remember, the franchise are those who are considered citizens and can participate in government. They largely broadened that, including non-property holders, which I know that doesn't seem like a big deal now, but back then that was a huge revolutionary break from tradition in England. The idea, right, that had long persisted that only those who are landowning taxpayers have a stake in society. They have something to lose. They've demonstrated responsible, um, initiative and ambition to prove that they are responsible and could be trusted with participating in government. Now they're allowing it to non-property owning white men. So they broadened the franchise. There was a two-branch legislator in Pennsylvania prior to the War for Independence. They did away with the upper house because to them the upper house was too much like the royal councils or the House of Lords back in England, that it was just a very aristocratic body, and they usually carried out checks on the decisions and powers of the lower popularly elected house. And so they did away with it altogether and had a one branch legislator. And they also did away with the governor position. They had somewhat of an executive council instead of one person, but it didn't even have power to approve and veto the laws made by this one house popularly elected legislator. So they deliberately made the aristocratic form of their government, the upper house, and the monarchical, right, the strong executive part of government done away with in this new constitution. So their new government in Pennsylvania, you could argue, became much more um, democratic, right, than it had previously been prior to this new constitution. And so, as state after state issued constitutional, new constitutions, new state governments during the War for Independence, away breaking free from England, a lot of them were very enlightened, very democratic. Many of them issued bills of rights, list of enumerated human rights that were to be protected by this new government for the common person. So, in many ways, we were somewhat, for lack of a better way of putting it, the states were in a very democratic and enlightened mood during and just after the War for Independence. But the problem is, right, says this argument, is when the people had their chance at government, they blew it. They shot themselves in the foot, and namely, by behaving in such a way that absolutely fed into the negative criticisms of democratic rule. They did the very things that Aristotle and other critics of democracy claimed happen under a democratic government, right? So for one, you had issues of the frontiers and people wanting to extend their state's territory into the West. And like we talked about with the British last assignment, that's going to lead to conflict with Native Americans. That's going to lead to them immediately making demands on their colonial legislators or their new state legislators to better represent them in these new Western towns, which of course in and of itself sounds great, right? But of course that causes conflict. Um, but then also economically, is kind of like back with the Gracchus brothers of Rome, is many states, right? Many of the people did not want to be taxed. And remember, there were practical reasons for paying taxes. We owed money to a lot of private creditors who had lent money to the Continental Congress, like Mr. Morris, one of the wealthiest people in the colonies, but also to foreign governments. France had given us a lot of money. We were indebted to the French government. And they did not want to, they didn't worry about paying those debts back for the very short-sighted reason that they're working hard and they don't want that money taken out of their pocket. So they don't want to play their part, right, and paying off our country's and our state's debts that we had incurred during the War for Independence. All right. Another thing is that they wanted access to credit. Remember, I would argue that while today I like to believe that the main avenue or stepping stone to the American dream is academia, getting your college degrees, etc., right? I would definitely make the argument that that was not the case yet at this time period. And I would make the argument that the main stepping stone to the American dream was arguably being an entrepreneur, becoming your own businessman. Okay. But it takes money to make money, right? So, how in the world are you going to start a business when you have nothing to begin with? So, you need a loan to help you get on your feet. And by the way, demographically, the main entrepreneurial pursuit that was chased after by Americans, common Americans who were ambitious in this generation, was cash crop farming, right? Instead of subsistence farming, growing your own food and living off of that, you and your family, you wanted to focus on one particular crop and sell it at some market for profit and get money for it, right? So what happens in states like Massachusetts with Shays Rebellion is the people, right, by and large, because life happens and there was no crop insurance at this time. You have a poor harvest for various reasons, right? Climate, by way of a drought or a flood, or by way of the infestation of some type of insect that eats away the crops, by way of changing fluctuations with markets. Because remember, the Spanish were shutting down the Mississippi River because they now have the Louisiana Territory next to us. The British were shutting off Caribbean trade from us. And so markets that they could sell their places in before and during the War for Independence were no longer open to them. You don't have refrigeration, not even close yet chronologically. And so if you don't sell your stuff in time, it spoils, right? Your wheat or whatever it is your cash crop entails. And so hence you become broke and you can't pay back that loan that you had begun to buy seed and tools and purchase more land to cultivate that wheat on, right? So what they did is they used their strength in numbers and the legislators, and they got the legislators to pass them stay laws that would grant them extra time to pay off their loans. And in some cases, they issued something that was a little bit akin to modern bankruptcy laws, where they eventually even went so far as saying that they could declare bankruptcy and never pay their creditors back. Well, needless to say, bankers, for practical reasons, are not going to want to lend money to them again if they've reneged on paying back their loans. So this becomes an economic issue with economic consequences. And so finally, in Massachusetts, the elected legislator says, okay, guys, enough's enough, debtors. I know that you've been pushing with your Democratic influence to help yourselves out, but enough's enough. We are collecting on the debts. And according to English common law, right, we could take your collateral, right, the money that you had in assets and property, and confiscate it from you for your failure to pay back your debts after a certain allotment of time. Not to mention, we could even put you briefly in debtor's jail for failing habitually to pay back your debts. So then what happens in Shays Rebellion is you have a guy named Job Shattuck, Nathan Smith, Daniel Shays, and in different counties in Western Massachusetts, they went to the courthouses where these men inevitably were going to be found convicted uh, of um, of failing to pay their debts and have their collateral, including their farms, confiscated from them. They put on their old Continental Army and militia Minuteman uniforms, came with guns by force, by threat of force, and chased off the judges and made them leave so that they could not convene these court sessions and confiscate property and arrest these debtors, right? Well, to conservatives like Hamilton and George Washington, this was infuriating. It was irresponsible because, after all, right, that's part of a personal virtue is paying back your debts, but also, right, the rule of law. We obtained that arguably from English political tradition. Of course, they had exceptions with the English Civil War and other moments of violent breakouts back in England itself. But for the most part, England was proud of of handling everything according to lawful legal procedures, right? And so the fact that they were threatening to use force and threatening to shoot judges just for doing their job and punishing those who would refuse to pay their debts, to them, this was in violation of the rule of law, and this would lead to anarchy and perhaps even class warfare between the debtors and the creditors to whom they owed money, and not to mention to the legal establishments that were trying to enforce the laws. So at any rate, right, the argument is this type of behavior played into the hands of the conservatives so that they could kind of proverbially tell the liberals, right, who had also read this stuff in their classical education, see guys, I told you, a government when it is too democratic becomes chaotic. The people are not led by civic virtue, putting what's best for the entire community ahead of their own selfish desires, but selfishly and greedily just pursue their own self-interest, even at the expense of law and order and of their creditors who have money owed to them, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Articles of Confederation was deliberately weak, right? So that there was not even coercive tax powers. So that if the majority of those in the continental, in this Congress of the Articles of Confederation, right, elected from each of the states, if the majority of them as a body said okay to a tax, they couldn't even enforce it, what we're accustomed to now, right? The majority of both houses pass a tax law. It doesn't matter if our congressional district of 30,000 civilians in the Modesto area says no, if a majority in Congress had decided upon and passed that tax, it's being collected here whether we want it or not. That was not the case of the Articles of Confederation. And so if their state leaders said no, that tax was not collected in our state, only in those states in which their elected leaders said okay to it. So notice the Confederate government was extremely weak. And again, they did this on purpose because libertarian thought was very prevalent at this time, right? Government ought to be small, deliberately weak, and as unobtrusive into our lives as possible, and not highly centralized, because strong government cannot and should not be trusted. And so the argument is, right, as a conservative saw and increasingly convinced the libertarian liberals who feared big government that this deliberately decentralized and weak, somewhat democratic confederacy was chaotic, and it was living up to the very negative stereotypes that the old Greco and other writers had warned our founding fathers about. All right. And so that type of irresponsible behavior, chaotic behavior happened. Then going from democracy to a confederacy. Remember, in a confederacy, each state is almost independent. It's almost autonomous, right? Except for grand exceptions like an invasion of our land, etc. And so in foreign policy. You look at the Italian city states during the Renaissance period. You look at the Scandinavian countries, right, in Northern Europe, and they had issues with their confederacies. As you might guess, um, problems with being too decentralized. So hence states vying with and jealously competing with and fighting with one another, and just this lack of unity, right? And this is exacerbated by the fact that if you are surrounded by potential international enemies who might be bullying you, a loose confederacy doesn't seem to be capable or willing to unite, right? In particular with a strong central military, etc., to keep this from happening. And that's what seemed to happen here in our Confederacy. Like I mentioned, the Spanish had control of the Louisiana Territory to our western border, and they closed off the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was arguably a lifeline for us with trade. Because remember, it's not until a couple generations later that we engage in infrastructure growth, right? With roads and canals and later railroads and later highways, etc. So this hurt us economically. And then not to mention our prestige as a new country being bullied by our neighbors immediately. The British had broken their promise to evacuate the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes area and basically told us, what are you going to do about it? They closed off the Caribbean trade to us and instituted harsh economic sanctions against us. And so our loose confederacy seemed to be unwilling and too weak to do anything about this. And then also our states vied with one another. You could look up something called the commercial wars between New Jersey and New York, where it turned into this petty, um, you know, vindictive series of laws against one another's merchants and goods, goods coming from New Jersey to New York and merchants coming from New York to New Jersey, etc., right? Trying to sell their stuff, they put heavy taxes on one another. They had zones where they declared monopolies, where only fellow people, fellow merchants and businessmen from New Jersey could sell these products and not New Yorkers. And so then the other New York would retaliate, et cetera, et cetera. You had boundary issues where Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia fought with one another and their legislators and even threatened force because they both claimed some of the same Western territories, contending that that territory belonged to them and their state. And so, again, with number one, right, it's a very um, somewhat monotonous, long held interpretation, but that we tried a more democratic, deliberately decentralized, and weak government under the Articles of Confederation, and it played into the hands of the conservatives, right? and and convincing those who are moderates, who are in the middle, and even convincing the liberals, not necessarily to change ideological sides and become federalists and join their party or anything like that, but at least to put up less of a fight when they met in first Annapolis and then ultimately in Philadelphia to discard this Confederacy and come up with a government that is less democratic and more highly centralized, right? In the republic that we know of now. And so, like I said, that's the thesis for number one. Does anyone have any questions about that? You guys feel rather comfortable? Okay, thank you, Bella. All right, good, good, good. All right, so then transitioning to number two, okay. Pauline Maier, in her book on ratification, she gives a very bittersweet thesis, and that she contends, right? She demonstrates a revisionist, somewhat cynical view of our founding fathers, that not only philosophically, they believed that this Confederate government, uh, played into the hands of what they had read about in their classical education, that too much democracy is dangerous and prone to anarchy and class warfare, and that a confederation or Confederate government is too decentralized and hence also too chaotic, with states vying with one another, refusing to cooperate, uh, and leading to friction and and lack of strength when it comes to international rivals, etc. Right? But she goes further than that, and she implies in revisionist fashion that the founding fathers also had selfish desires to scrap this government. Right? So when you look at the Constitution, there is a property clause, for instance, that they put in that stated basically that all contracts, all legal contracts that say you own certain land, that say that you own certain slaves and property, that they are that or that you have money owed to you as a lender or creditor to some debtor, right? That whatever contracts existed prior to this new government, right, of 1787, uh, that they are to be recognized under this new government. So, hence, right, that seems to imply a bit of self interest and selfishness on behalf of the well to do and wanting to ensure that they kept a hold of their wealth, they kept a hold of their property and the money owed them, etc. Right? Um, Not to mention, right, their fear of rebellion, right, as some type of class warfare. The Constitution is going to empower, under Article 1, Section 8, Congress to be able to raise an army, to be able to nationalize the state militias in case of an invasion or domestic rebellion, to be able to use, right, to put down the rebellion and restore order. This was very conservative, obviously, and it also, right, noted a uh, could be tied to the fears that the conservatives had of a class warfare, another Shays rebellion, right? And so you have that component. When you look at the branches of government, look under the Constitution, how many of the major branches were popularly elected by citizens, and you'll find it's pretty darn weak as far as how many offices were elected and how many more were not elected, right? So this Constitution, in many ways, compared to the Confederation that we had just experienced, was rather conservative, okay, and in line with what the well-to-do leaders wanted. Not to mention the well-to-do leaders had been habitually elected into office, seen as the better sort amongst their constituents, and they put it upon themselves. They didn't put forth any kind of a popular referendum for the people themselves in their states to agree to scrapping the Confederation. They took the decision into their own hands in Philadelphia in deciding to scrap the new government and come up with a less democratic, more centralized one. So notice, right, there's evidence of self-interest and their own factions agenda amongst the well-to-do founding fathers. Remember, a faction is a group that shares the same economic self-interest and or beliefs. So at any rate, they do this, right? Then when they write the Constitution, they close it to the press and to the public so that people could not participate in the proceedings. While Madison and others wrote notes of what transpired as far as speeches by certain people who voted one way or another on certain suggestions and propositions, they kept it secret. And then many of them pushed for um, going back to their old Articles of Confederation state legislators, because they were already elected therein, right? And approving of this Constitution or ratifying it. And in some ways, that's likened to proofreading your own paper, right? Of course, they wrote the Constitution. So they largely go back to their own states. Of course, they're going to approve it because it was their own doing. So it didn't seem very democratic. It didn't seem very transparent in allowing their own constituents to see what they were up to. So in her book, right, you have a very exciting narrative over the ratification or approval process of this Constitution. So in different states, right, it was at a higher pitch than in others, but by and large, you see a common theme of popular insistence upon participation in this process. That the common people said, oh, heck no. You well-to-do founding fathers are not going to simply, come up with your own new government and approve it yourselves. So you had demands in states that the Constitution be printed for popular perusal so that people could read over it themselves to see what they think of it. You even had some rare occasions in which states demanded that there be a popular referendum so that the decision goes to direct popular vote given out to the citizens of the state and let them, by majority rule, decide if they want to ratify it or not. And also equally interesting to me, what that I was not familiar with prior to reading this book, is especially in the New England states, is many people showed up at the ratification conventions of their states to approve of this Constitution or not, uninvited. They had been informally elected by the constituents of their own villages and towns, right? Came uninvited to the ratification conventions and made bold demands and said, hey, first of all, on behalf of the city of Braintree, Massachusetts, or whatever it is, right? I'm here to stay. I'm here to sit on the proceedings, whether you like it or not. And also, here's a list of demands from the people of my town saying we are not okay with this Constitution unless this, or this is implemented. And by and large, according to her book, most of their demands pertain to individual rights that they wanted explicitly stated in this new Constitution, right? Inviolable human rights coming from the French Enlightenment primarily, right? For the entitlement of the citizens to certain opportunities and protections so that the government could not abuse those liberties, right? And infringe upon those liberties because it would be written in stone in this new Constitution. And so, as you might guess, those demands manifested themselves and were synthesized together into the Bill of Rights that we're so proud of to this very day, right? So the First Amendment, right, largely tied to the writings of Voltaire, the freedom of expression, the freedom to peacefully protest the government, right, to engage in non-libel writing against the government, right? And remember, libel is just if you know it's a lie and you nevertheless put forth that incriminating, indicting evidence against the government, knowing full well that it's a lie, that short of libel, you are free to be able to protest the government. So many of the first 10 amendments are tied to due process from Beccaria, his writings, arguably. And so the right to against unreasonable searches and seizures without probable cause and a judicial warrant to get into your stuff. Your famous Fifth Amendment that you cannot be tortured or forced into self-incrimination, into admitting or confessing of your guilt. The right to an attorney to be protected by that. The right to a speedy a trial and not languish in a jail waiting for years to be tried, as happens sometimes under the English system. Um, the right to counter-examine your hostile witnesses, right, and challenge their claims, and to make sure that you can call up favorable witnesses for yourself. And also, which was really big, according like the Scottish Enlightenment, etc., is that your justice should be carried out by your own peers, people who know what it's like to walk in your shoes, people from your same locality, who largely are the same economic class, uh, and so that it will optimize your opportunity for a favorable and fair due process, right? Opportunity to exonerate yourself and declare and prove your innocence. So those were all, various degrees in different states demanded. And so, of course, we know, right, that the founding fathers are going to make that compromise, right, for this Constitution to be ratified by 9 states of the 13, which needed to be done for its approval. So then, therefore, now we have the Bill of Rights, right? We have, including the 10th Amendment, you guys, whereby they stated, hey, Article 1, Section 8 and other areas give a lot of power to this new central government. What about the states? Well, the 10th Amendment says that whatever is not explicitly given to Congress and the federal government, nor covered under the necessary and proper clause, which we'll get into later, is reserved or left over to the states. So nothing is spoken about police powers, educational systems. So those technically, according to the 10th Amendment, are reserved to the states, right? Um, Transparency, proceedings in Congress from time to time being printed for the public to see what was spoken about in the congressional meetings, who proposed what, who voted in what way of yes or no on a certain proposition, so they could see what their elected reps were up to, right? So a lot of these enlightened components that we have to this day that we're proud of in our Constitution, according to Pauline Maier, were not initially given nor intended by the conservative, well-to-do founding fathers, but popular pressure was pushed against them during the ratification process, and they were desperate to ratify this Constitution, right? Because it would all have been done in vain if they couldn't get 9 states to approve of it. And so that hence they grudgingly conceded and said, okay, fine, we acquiesce. We'll put in a Bill of Rights. We'll put in this enlightened segment or that one, etc. Right? So to me, it's a very bittersweet thesis because you leave with kind of a negative taste in your mouth toward the founding fathers as being very uber conservative and elitist, but you're very proud of the common people of that generation and making their voice heard and making these downright demands upon the founding fathers that they were going to make this new republic more enlightened than the founding fathers initially had intended it to be. All right, so those are the 2 numbers. Are there any questions? You guys feel like you have a decent command of both arguments? All right, so any questions at all, you guys? Because technically this constitutes the end of this assignment of this Zoom meeting. If there aren't any other questions or comments. Thank you, Bella.
Mr. Cal, I have a question.
Sure.
As you were talking, I was reading through the chapter on the Constitution.
Sure.
Can you explain why they excluded Indians in the Constitution?
Oh, that's a great question. Is The Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment was really big on supposedly informing our public citizenry and our political leaders on what they wanted to demand and stand for as a separate country independent from England, part of our self identity, right? Even these liberal enlightened writings contended, right, that they advocated the image of the noble savage, right, that Benjamin Franklin was big on, and that was right is that popular, especially popular Republican government ought to its health, its safety, its longevity are largely going to be tied to the virtue of the people, right? And making sound, wise decisions and behaving themselves, right? Um, to the virtue of the people and to the wisdom of the people, right? So as we'll get to later on with Thomas Jefferson, he voiced a lot of democratic ideas, right, of giving more power to the common people. But he had a huge caveat to that, is he said he wanted a crusade against ignorance, and he wanted the common people, as they could now progressively participate in government, to become educated, right, through a public school system, whereby they could make wiser, better, safer decisions, right? So you have to keep that in mind. Even in ties to religion, John Adams, even the not so religious George Washington, made contentions that it was imperative that Christianity kept a strong cultural hold over the people, because it acted kind of like uh, a what's the word I'm trying a straitjacket, if you will, right? That the people's natural inhibitions, their appetite, as the Greeks called it, their id, as Freud would call it, right? If they just followed their natural selfish impulses, the republic would be in danger. So forces like Christianity taught them a sense of sin, right and wrong, how people ought to behave and ought not to behave. Benjamin Franklin, agnostic, not a Christian, he himself even said, if men are devils with religion, what would they be without it? Right? That it at least had a restraining hold on trying to keep people on their best behavior. So much of their rhetoric was tied, right, to people, to a republic lasting, depending upon, right, its duration, depending upon the virtue and intelligence of the people. So the idea of the noble savage, right, goes back to Columbus early in this class, propagating that idea that Native Americans, remember, like with Columbus and the Arawak and other Caribbean natives, where he said they walked around as naked as the day they were born, that like a child who's naked and doesn't even know any better because the child is innocent, right? That child, there's a great sense of innocence to that child, but there's a very patronizing, condescending part to this image, is that of course you can't trust that child to rule or participate in government. He's just a child. So they infantilized Native Americans and called them noble savages. That on the one hand, they had not yet learned, they said, about civilization's vices, right? That Voltaire wrote so much about greed, ambition, duplicity, etc., right? So in the one way, it was condescendingly um, complimentary toward the Native Americans, that they weren't as corrupt as white people. But it also, like I said, infantilized them, saying that they had yet to become educated and learn about the ways of civilization. So hence the notion was, right, is that Native Americans can and ought only to be trusted to become integrated with society, join it, right? And to me, integrated is the full circle of social, political, and economic. That politically they can be enfranchised as citizens and participate in government. Socially, they can intermarry with white people and live and share the same culture, etc., with them. And economically, have the same rights, privileges, opportunities as everyone else, right? But according to Enlightenment thought, there was a big caveat or condition that Native Americans ought to be integrated only if they assimilate, right? Only if they drop their culture and their ways and traditions and normative behavior and embrace those of Euro Americans, of white European descent Americans, right? And so that's why it says, right, it separates them as Indian tribes not taxed. So notice it is disenfranchising them, right? It's treating them as a separate nation within the nation, but it's doing so collectively, not against the individual Native American, but against the tribes themselves as a collective entity. So hence, if they choose, right, individually to go to a white man's school and to assimilate to, Euro-American culture and institutions, then the argument is society ought to be opened up to allowing them to integrate and participate politically.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, makes sense.
So yeah,
Thank you.
no problem. But notice, right, a huge, you could at least make that argument, however weak or contrived you think that argument is, at least that argument existed as far as their hypocrisy with Native Americans. But with women, right, with African Americans, it's a different thing. And we'll get more into that when we do Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
And then not to mention what I think is a huge failure at the Constitutional Convention is they do not address citizenship. Because if they had adhered faithfully to their Enlightenment readings, right? Enlightenment was about natural rights that all human beings are entitled to the moment that they're born as human beings, right? So why they chose to allow each state to decide upon who could be a citizen and who could
Who
not,
couldn't, right?
that's absolutely hypocritical in light of the Enlightenment and very conservative, right? And conserving old English political traditions. And it surely wasn't very impressive.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No problem. All right. Anybody else?
So this assignment's due Sunday, right?
That's right.
This one,
Yes.
okay,
So Sunday night at midnight, please.
okay.
All right.
Have a good one, thank you.
You too, Chetney. You guys have a great day, okay, and a great week. Again, you have any questions or comments, you're very welcome, Kathana. Canvas message me. Otherwise, I hope this helps. And you guys keep it up, okay? We're moving along quickly. And I'm proud of you. All right, have a good week, okay?